Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today to talk to you about these programs and how you can use them in your next disaster or emergency. I'm Rosie Krueger. I'm the State Director of Child Nutrition Programs here at the Vermont Agency of Education. So that means that I oversee the implementation of the school meals programs, as well as a couple of other federal child nutrition programs that we have active in child care centers, adult day centers, during the summertime, as well as some food that we distribute to food pantries. And during both the COVID-19 emergency as well as the summer 2023 flooding incident, I have been activated to co-lead or lead the state's mass feeding response in terms of emergency management. And that's a new role for me. And in that, I think particularly this summer, it became pretty clear that that feeding wasn't necessarily top of mind or included in a lot of local emergency plans. Particularly this summer, we would reach out to EMDs and try and kind of gauge what was going on and whether there were needs for feeding. And we were hearing a lot of, well, I'm not hearing anything, but I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily know. I think the food pantry might be doing something. I think that maybe a church might be doing something. But it became clear that folks weren't necessarily sure of what was going on in their communities with regard to feeding, that it may not have been something that was in the plan, and that folks weren't aware of a lot of the resources that we do have available. And this session isn't here to make you think, oh my gosh, this is a huge amount of additional work that I need to take on. What I want to do today is introduce you to the folks in your community who can handle that. Spoiler, you do have people in your community who are already very well positioned to take on the work of feeding people in an emergency or a disaster, and to take advantage of these federal programs that we do have available to help you out with funding that work. A spoiler is that those folks are your school food service directors. And so I really hope that your number one takeaway today, if you are a local EMD, is to pick up the phone and find out who your local food service director is. If you're not sure, you can either call the supervisory union office and ask that question, or you can call me. My contact information is at the end of the slide, or reach out to me via email, and we'll make sure that you know who that person is for your community if you're not sure already. So today we're going to talk about how these federal child nutrition programs can be used for emergency feeding. And these federal child nutrition programs are blue skies programs that operate all the time to feed children and vulnerable members of our communities. And they're funded and regulated by the United States Department of Agriculture, or the USDA. However, that funding runs through state agencies down to the local level, program operators or sponsors. And in Vermont, these programs run through us here at the Vermont Agency of Education, which is where I work, and we're responsible for implementing those programs in Vermont. So we're kind of the middleman. We pass through the funding to the local schools, childcare centers, nonprofits, local governments, who make and provide those meals to the children and other recipients. And so, as I've kind of mentioned already, the largest of those programs is the school meals program. But we also operate, again, the child and adult care food program. Our acronym there is the CACFP, and that provides meals in child care centers and adult day centers, and the summer food service program, or the SFSP, which provides meals to children when school is not in session. And then we do also manage those USDA foods, which are the foods that the USDA buys to support American agriculture. But also, once they bought those foods, they provide them to the child nutrition programs and to food pantries. So USDA, the Food and Nutrition Service at USDA doesn't have special programs specifically for disasters other than DSNAP, which we're not going to talk about here today. Instead, their existing kind of blue skies programs have flexibilities that allow them to be used in disaster situations. And so we can kind of take those programs and pivot them using those flexibilities when we need to. And so today we're going to talk about what you, as local and state emergency management officials, should know about how you can use those programs locally to feed people in those situations. And up here on the screen, I have some examples of how we've already used these programs here in Vermont in the past few emergencies. So in up here, this Facebook advertisement for free meals is from Orleans Southwest Supervisory Union. Hardwick is the big town in that supervisory union, as I'm sure you're all aware, was heavily impacted by the flooding. So in July 2023, the Orleans Southwest Supervisory Union continued to operate their usual federally funded open summer meal sites for kids 18 and under. Those are sites where any kid can show up and get a breakfast or a lunch or a snack, kind of no questions asked. There's no pre-sign up needed. They're sometimes held at the school, but also at parks and pools and kind of other places where kids will be, summer camps throughout the summer, libraries, that sort of thing. So that's kind of a blue skies program. Orleans Southwest Supervisory Union, they kept operating that program in spite of the flooding. They only had to close one site, and they were really creative to keep operating that program. They called me several times trying to figure out how we could get them some ingredients because the roads were out, and so they weren't able to get their normal deliveries. And we actually have a number of program flexibilities that we were able to offer them to allow them to keep operating that program in spite of that. Those impacts. So they did that. They made sure that there was no loss of access to meals for those kids who were normally relying on them. And because those sites were open, that meant that kids who maybe were newly experiencing food disruption because of the flooding did have a place to access meals. But then they went beyond that. And they also provided meals to the shelter that was set up at Hazen Union High School. And they were able to provide meals to adult survivors who were at the shelter by using the USDA foods that they had on hand. So those foods are eligible for replacement or reimbursement by the federal government. Again, taking that kind of blue skies program of USDA foods, where we have food on hand in the schools that the federal government has purchased, and USDA allows us that flexibility to use those foods in a disaster situation, and then we'll come in later and reimburse or replace those foods. And we'll talk more about that later in the session. So they use those foods to feed adults. And you can see here in the advertisement, they're saying adults in need affected by the flooding may receive a free meal today at Hardwick Elementary School. It's pretty tiny. I don't know if you can see that, but that's part of their advertisement there. And then the other foods and supplies that they use to feed adult survivors will likely be eligible. And, we're still going through all the kind of post-disaster paperwork here, but because those were emergency protective measures and because Orleans Southwest Supervisory Union is a public entity, as a local government entity, those supplies and foods are likely going to be eligible for either 75% or 100% FEMA reimbursement for emergency protective measures. So we're going to take a combination of all of those federal resources and ensure that the school likely is not going to have lost money for providing all those meals in that situation. So that is kind of a traditional disaster response in terms of what we can do with some of our programs. We keep feeding the kids, feed additional kids who might need to be fed, and then also feed those adult survivors at a shelter or generally through what we call disaster congregate feeding there. And then some other pictures here, you might recognize some of these. The governor's executive order closing schools in March of 2020 recognized the essential role of the school meals programs in feeding kids and required that schools continue to make meals available to all of their students, even though school was closed. And even though we were, of course, generally folks were required to stay home. But school meals programs were considered essential and they continued to operate. So because school was closed unexpectedly, we could no longer operate the school meals programs, but we were able to activate the summer food service program to provide free meals to children 18 and under using federal funding. And so even though the program is called the Summer Food Service Program, the regulations specifically allow it to be used when school has closed due to an emergency situation. Anytime school has closed unexpectedly during the school year, we can activate the Summer Food Service Program. So during COVID, we did that, and then we applied for and received many, many waivers. I think almost 100 different waivers from the federal government in order to make that program better fit the very unique needs of the COVID emergency. But you may remember seeing coolers next to people's mailboxes in your communities during that time. And that was because schools were using their school buses to deliver meals to families using the summer food service program. So they received federal funding for all of those meals that they were providing. And then because they were there and operating and producing meals, school meals programs were then the quickest resource for the state to activate when it came to a resource for providing meals to homeless Vermonters who were housed in hotels. And so these programs were already creating meals for distribution to children. So folks were already there, they were already getting food and supplies, and they already were producing meals at a really affordable price because they are the school meals programs and are used to working on a budget. And so the state ended up contracting with 22 different supervisory unions and school districts to provide almost 320,000 meals to Vermonters housed at 58 hotels between between April and December of 2020, before we then ultimately consolidated to longer term contracts with a few larger catering vendors after it became clear that this was going to go on for a while and we needed to kind of consolidate some of those operations. But school meals programs were just the quickest thing for us to activate. They were already ready, already operating, already producing meals at an affordable price. And so we were able to buy meals from those programs to serve the adults that we needed to serve there. So those are some examples of how we've activated those programs in the past couple of emergencies. And today we're going to talk about how you can use those resources in your own communities without necessarily even reaching out to us at the state. There may be some places that we need to be involved, but again, I'm going to really encourage you throughout this to reach out to your local school food service director and have a conversation ahead of a disaster or emergency to find out what their specific resources are and how you can work together and plan for this. So why would you turn to school meals programs for emergency feeding? I've given you a bunch of ideas already, but here are some more. So they are located in all parts of the state. So Vermont has a state law that actually requires that all public schools offer breakfast and lunch through the federal child nutrition programs. And that law, you may know, was recently updated to actually require that those programs offer meals for free under those programs to every child every day. And so those programs are located in all parts of the state. They also operate at a number of independent schools, including all the academies. And they may be operating at your designated shelter. So if your designated shelter in your community is a school, there is if it's a public school, there is certainly a school meals program there. If it's an independent school, there may be a school meals program there. So all over the state, they employ staff who are already trained in food safety, efficient meal preparation, menu planning, figuring out affordable menus with ingredients on hand. They're really good at their jobs. They do this every day, and they're used to this. The program probably already has delivery vehicles and hot and cold holding transportation units like Cambros and coolers for moving meals around your community. If you were planning to use the school kitchen already for emergency feeding, the school food service staff are the ones who really know that kitchen and that equipment already. So rather than trying to bring in volunteers and get them to figure out how to operate, the huge can opener for the number 10 cans or the meat slicer or any of this equipment that can be actually pretty dangerous if it's operated by folks who don't know how to use it, you've got some professionally trained staff there who already know what to do and how to use that kitchen, and they know even the finicky little things about how that particular kitchen works. Um, and then these staff are already employed or contracted through a public entity, the school district, that could be eligible for FEMA public assistance in a declared emergency or disaster. So there's already a path to fund their hours worked. And many school districts in Vermont operate a self-operated school food service program, which means that they employ their school food service food service staff directly. And then others operate with a contract with the food service management company. So either one can work in this situation because the holder of that contract with the food service management company is the school district. So any costs that they incur would be incurred again by that public entity. If school is in session or the summer meals program is in session, there are likely food and supplies already on hand there because they are already preparing to provide a lot of meals. And if that food was on hand and then school is closed and electricity is lost, that perishable food might be going to waste. So we don't want to waste that food if we don't have to, and using it to do emergency feeding is going to be a good use of it. And then a really big factor here is that these school food service staff likely live in your community, they're part of your community, and they want to help. And we saw that for sure with Orleans Southwest Supervisory Union in the summer flooding. You know, their food service director, Val Husey, she was the one who really stepped up and was like, okay, we're gonna do this, we're gonna figure out how to make these meals. And then she called me later to tell me what she was doing and to ask for some help. And so you've got folks in all of your communities who really want to be there and help, and this is the way that they can best help these school food service staff. So use that help. And then, as we've kind of alluded to already, there are these federal funds there that are available to help pay for meals, specifically for children when school is closed unexpectedly. And then we do have ways of paying for some of the meals served to impacted adults as well. And then finally, as you're probably aware, your schools do already have these existing communication channels to get information out to families. And so by partnering with a school, that's a really good way to get information out to a large part of your community. We're going to talk about these strategies today. First, I want to stop and just check to see, I can't see the chat, and I don't know if we have any questions that I've missed that I should make sure to address or anything I need to clarify.
So there's nothing in the chat currently, and I've got a question in the room. Go ahead.
Hi, with the town that I live in, the school district is a relatively large school district. They have 3 elementaries, middle school, high school, and a tech center. And that district is pretty great about it, looking at opening a shelter in that location when we need it. The facility manager said, don't worry about the food, I'll get it up there if you need it. I have an agreement with the food shelf already that I can go raid their facility if needed. So in saying that, I've talked to other EMDs that I had mentioned that the USDA could pick up the tab of food that was used, and they have no knowledge of it. They've gone to their school district has no knowledge of it. How can you get that word out to the school district saying, hey, you can help your towns out by allowing them to use the school as a shelter because you have a generator, it has bathrooms, and you have food on it. And some school districts, I guess, in the state of Vermont are being very stingy about releasing those means of help.
Yeah, so I'm going to take that in 2 parts. So one is the question of using the foods. We do training for school food service programs on how to activate their programs in a disaster. We did a lot of training on it kind of in the years leading up to COVID, and then everything kind of flipped on its head, and this training got kind of set aside during the last 3 years. And so kind of on our agenda this coming year is to remind folks about that and do new training. We do, ahead of every kind of big hurricane that's projected to hit the state, that sort of thing, we will send out emails saying, reminder, you're authorized to use your USDA foods. If you do, let us know. But I think the big thing is to have that personal conversation. Reach out, say, hey, I heard this thing. The state says you can help. Can we talk? I'm going to give you a list of questions at the end of the session to kind of have that conversation. And then I'm telling the schools the same thing. Reach out to your local EMD, find out who that person is, and have that conversation. So that's about using the food and using the food service program. The second piece of it is using the school as a shelter. And that's a little bit more nuanced. Our first strategy here is keep school open if possible. And I'm going to talk about that more in a second. And then Ted Fisher has a session on keeping schools open at the end of the day today. And we want to make sure, if your school is going to be the best resource for a shelter, then that's one thing. And the school, that's a potential good opportunity for your community. But if that means closing school, that is a really difficult consideration. And that's really going to impact kids in a negative way. And so we're not from the agency going to be pushing schools to be a shelter no matter what, particularly if it's going to mean closing school. So I do want to kind of give that nuance to that conversation. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Sorry, I'm going to try and mute whoever that was. It's just going to take me a second.
So I hope that helped with that. But definitely this is an evolving conversation. I think we really hadn't started doing training on this until about, I think 2015 was when we started training schools on this. We had a couple years of being able to provide them training on it, that this is a resource. And then of course, anybody who's new since about 2019 has not had that opportunity to have that training from us. So that might be why you're hearing from the school that they're not aware of this possibility.
Thank you.
All right, so here are our strategies here. And I am not
Sorry, Rosie. We've
Yeah.
got another question in the room. Go ahead, Jill.
Sorry, Rosie, it's Jill.
Hi, Jill.
Rosie and I work together at the agency. And just to piggyback there, and I think you'll also hear this from Ted, but I think one of the critical things, as Rosie was saying, about having conversations ahead of time about potentially feeding people during the emergency, but we really want to encourage both schools and towns to, when you're looking at your all hazards emergency plan, to be thinking about how is the school a resource for the community and how is the community a resource for the school, and actually have that really clearly written out in the plans and to have those conversations ahead of time. So you're not trying to figure it out after the flood or after the ice storm. So I think that there's a real opportunity here actually to build these relationships, because schools are really critical partners. And I think sometimes because of some like statutory divisions that exist between towns and schools, that it means that sort of artificially plays out in the emergency plan as well.
Yeah. Well, I do have an agreement, a plan with our schools.
Yeah.
But I was speaking on behalf of somebody else who doesn't and who
Exactly
went there.
I think it's consistent.
Yeah, and I was blown away with what they were telling me.
And I'll piggyback off that for another minute. And it's not just write it once in the plan. I'm sure that's not what you're doing, but I've met with so many schools and towns where someone 5 years ago wrote this plan.
Right.
Yeah.
None of those people exist.
Like they were neighbors, they knew each other, they talked all the time, a lot of them left.
None of those people exist anymore. The resources that were in the plan may or may not exist anymore. And so it's making sure to keep that plan up to date, to refresh those relationships every year, and then to exercise that plan when you get to a good place where you can actually test it to say, we say that we're going to be able to do this. Can we actually do this?
And we saw this play out in real time between districts, like the ones that had those relationships and had been exercising those relationships were, and then the ones they were ready to go, and then the ones that maybe it existed on paper but not in reality, those are the ones that struggled. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we'll stop hijacking this from Rosie. Back to you, Rosie.
All really great and important discussion for sure. So our number one strategy here is to keep schools open if possible. I'm gonna expand on all these strategies in a minute. But the next strategy is that if school must be closed, the school may be able to activate the summer food service program to feed children 18 and under. So important to note here, this is not just students, but this is all children 18 and under. Another strategy is that an organization that, potentially the town government, a local nonprofit, whoever's kind of leading feeding efforts, can potentially purchase meals from the school meals program for adults and for children that are not covered through the school meals program or the summer food service program. We talked a little bit already about how schools can use USDA foods to reduce the costs for those purchased meals, and we're going to talk more about that. And then if the school meals program isn't able to produce meals for whatever reason, those USDA foods that are on hand could be provided to other organizations to produce meals. Those might be emergency feeding organizations or our friends over at the Red Cross, other folks like that. If a congregate emergency shelter is going to be set up, you could consider using the CACFP to provide 3 meals a day to children 18 and under at that shelter. This is a less good option, and we'll talk about it, but it's probably not the one you're going to use. We want to make sure that whatever you're doing, you're going to document all your costs, including food and supplies used, the number of people that you serve. That's an important factor in getting some reimbursement. The number of volunteer hours, the number of hours worked by the school food service staff. And the reason you're documenting all of that is for possible FEMA reimbursement and also for possible USDA reimbursement. And then we do have this option. It doesn't quite fall cleanly under the child nutrition programs, but if grocery distribution is disrupted, you can inquire with us here at the Agency of Education, and you can reach us through the SEOC about doing disaster household distribution of USDA foods. So that's not hot meals, that's actual distribution of kind of grocery items that might be on hand already. And we'll talk about that if we have time. So keep schools open if possible. This is our kind of number one strategy. So I mentioned already that all public schools in Vermont are required to offer breakfast and lunch, and many independent schools in Vermont do as well. And new since COVID in the past year, we do have this state universal meals law that requires that schools offer free breakfast and lunch to all students. So, and then we do have some schools that also offer an after-school snack or after-school supper meals to all their students as well, using the federal programs. So if you end up closing school, you need to be aware that students are now going to be missing at least 2 meals per weekday, and maybe more than that. And this is going to be, your most vulnerable students for sure. This is going to be a really difficult issue for them. But also now for some of your more affluent families, it may not be a matter of not being able to afford the meals, but it might be a matter of the fact that because the students normally get meals at school, they don't grocery shop for that much food during the week. And so if school is closed and, the roads are out, these families may be having difficulty with food as well, just because they're not able to acquire the food. So this is kind of a change in the food landscape in the state now to be aware of, is that because of the universal meals law, kids are accessing both breakfast and lunch at school. And if we suddenly close school, they're going to miss out on that access. So one of your first conversations that I'd love for you to have with your school food service program is to ask what would be needed to keep that school food service program operational in the event of the disasters that are most likely to hit that building. So do they need backup power? Do they need clean water? Will they need hand washing and toilet facilities? Are there specific roads that their delivery vehicles travel on? So this may be delivery vehicles bringing in ingredients, food deliveries, or it may be the delivery vehicles that the school uses to move food from, say, a preparation kitchen to another school, or to do delivery throughout the district. So have those conversations ahead of time to find out what those vulnerabilities are and see if there are ways that you can help with those to ensure that school can stay open and that school food service program can stay active. And then, as I mentioned, if you are closing school, really just be aware that there is this vulnerability now for these families in your community. So if we do have to close school, the USDA, as I mentioned, allows us to operate the summer food service program. So anytime school is closed unexpectedly or during the summer months. So that example earlier with Orleans Southwest Supervisory Union, they were already using the summer food service program because it was the summertime, and so they kept using it. But schools can, and program operators for that program can add additional sites throughout the summer months. So if you are needing to feed children in your community, this is a great option during the summer or when school is closed unexpectedly. This program is operated by either schools or nonprofit organizations or government organizations, but generally it's going to be fastest to have the school become the sponsor. They're kind of already set up with us, and that's going to be your quickest way to getting that program activated. If the location qualifies as low income, which is called area eligible in our program jargon, then all children 18 and under can be served meals with no applications. You don't have to track the names of the kids. You're just counting the number of meals served. If the location is not area eligible, then you can't do that. And so you need to have either a closed enrolled site, which is set up for a specific group of children that would qualify. And you could do this for a shelter because at a shelter, those children receiving meals, we would be considering them homeless because their homes had been disrupted. That's why they're at the shelter. That would make them eligible for the free meals under the program. So there are options here. You don't need to know what all these options are. The school will know more about how to do that, and then they can contact us and we can help them figure out the situation. But it is important to know that there are certain parts of your community likely that are going to be a good option for an area eligible site that can be an open meal site for all kids 18 and under. And there may be other parts of your community that aren't. And so as part of that first conversation with your school food service director, you're going to ask, are there locations in our community that are area eligible where you would want to set up a site in a disaster? Are there locations that aren't area eligible where you can't set up an open meal site? And so for you to have some awareness of what those locations are when you're thinking about where to set up the services for your community. Under this program, go ahead.
Rose, last question. Yeah. So when you're talking about these locations that are area eligible, are you talking about would a town qualify as an area eligible, or is it neighborhoods within a town, or is it counties? How does that lie?
So there are lots of ways. So if the school itself qualifies because children, a large number of children at the school are low income, then that can kind of spread to the whole town. But if the school doesn't qualify the town, then we can actually look at individual census tracts. And that could, allow us to make, the school's not eligible, but the library is, or the school's not eligible, but the community center is. And again, you don't need to worry about that. We at the state level, in conjunction with the school, can help you figure out what those sites are. Once a site is area eligible, they stay area eligible, I think, for 5 years, but that does change over time. So you may have some sites that weren't eligible previously, and then some stuff changes and they do become eligible, or sites that have been eligible for a long time and stop being eligible. Again, this is in the weeds, and I don't need you as an EMD to worry too much about that, other than to know that it's a thing, and that your school is going to need to be aware of that, and that might be a factor in planning where those sites are going to be.
Wonderful, thank you. And we've actually got another question in the room. Go ahead.
From the same person. So back in the day, families would qualify for free or reduced. And that percentage went into the federal database, blah, blah, blah. And they came up with a number that the percentage of folks in said town are more needy for help. And then they also did a thing with there's X amount of children in the school that are on a SPED program. And so that would give other dollars for education. So in saying that, how do you figure out what the without doing the free lunches anymore? How do you figure out the income tax?
So the lunches are free to the kids, but we're still doing a bunch of work behind the scenes to figure out figure all of that out. And without getting too far into the weeds, we're basically able to take information like Medicaid enrollment. So when children are enrolled in Medicaid, we can see the different levels of poverty in those households. We can look at 3 Squares Vermont enrollment, Reach Up enrollment, and some other factors that can give us that number of children who would qualify had they submitted an application. And so we have other ways of getting that without having to have the families submit applications to us. And so we still have that data about which schools are low income and which schools aren't. but it's not coming directly from the families necessarily for the purposes of the school meals program.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Back to you, Rosie.
All right. So in the summer food service program, whether it's the summer or whether it's being activated because of a unexpected school closure, we can offer 2 meals per day, 7 days per week. And that can be breakfast and lunch or breakfast and supper. So we can't offer both lunch and supper because those are the more expensive meals. And that's the way the program is set up. And then we can also offer a snack instead of a breakfast. So 2 meals per day. One is the less expensive snack or breakfast, and then lunch or supper. We can operate different meals at different locations in the community, but this is the limit for each location. And then meals are generally served in a congregate setting, and that's how it was for years and years and years. But since COVID, we actually now have permanent flexibility to allow non-congregate meals in rural areas. So in Vermont, this is all parts of the state except for Chittenden County and some parts of Franklin County. So now we do have that permanent flexibility to be able to allow families to pick up meals or have meals delivered to them. In areas that don't qualify for non-congregate, we may be able to submit a waiver to the USDA if there's a particular kind of disaster situation that would make that necessary. But in general, the program is kind of set up to do meals more in a congregate setting, like a shelter or a community location where people will come and congregate to get those meals. So for the kids, you can operate the summer food service program. But if for some reason you can't do that for the kids, or if you're trying to serve meals for adults, or you're trying to serve meals to kids, that third meal a day, the school meals program is always allowed to sell meals. This is kind of considered catering, basically, and they're allowed to do this. They can do it whether school is open or not. And they can sell meals to individuals. So if I walk into a school, I can buy a meal while school's, going on. Schools may have some rules about visitors, but if they allow like a parent to come in or they allow visitors to come in, they can sell a meal to me as an adult at their adult meal rate. And that rate just has to be set high enough to cover their costs. But they're usually extremely economical. It's usually around $5 to $6 for lunch or $3 to $4 for breakfast. And so they can sell those to individuals. They can also sell those to organizations. So if you've got an organization that's kind of managing some of the feeding, they can sell to that organization. And we actually did this during the flooding emergency. Berry School District ended up selling a lot of meals to the Red Cross for use in their shelters and then also for some of their distribution. So this is a great option to get meals, particularly if you don't have restaurants in your community, or if the restaurants in your community are not open, or if they're not going to be able to economically provide meals. Really encourage you to look towards the school meals programs. These meals are generally going to be extremely healthy. The school meals programs have changed significantly over the past 10 years. So these meals are going to include fruits and vegetables, protein, grain, milk. And so this is a really good option. Anytime you need meals and you have some money to pay for them, this is going to really maximize that funding. And this is something you can use, really tiny local emergency house fire, that kind of thing. You need to get meals for like a family that's being put up in a hotel or a bigger emergency like we've seen. I'm just looking at time here and getting a little worried here about getting through all of these strategies. But another option that I talked a little bit about already is these USDA foods that the federal government purchases for the school meals programs. So these are foods that the schools have on hand that have been purchased by the federal government. They're things like canned peaches, sliced turkey, frozen broccoli, pasta, kind of staple ingredient foods. And rather than kind of keeping these big warehouses of foods to use in a disaster situation all around the country, USDA allows us to take these foods that are on hand at the schools and then in a warehouse that we use to distribute to the schools, take those foods and use those in a disaster situation, and then USDA comes in later and reimburses or replaces those foods for the school district. So you can use these meals for disaster congregate feeding. It does require state agency approval. Like I said, we can pre-approve this, and we do send out an email to schools ahead of time if we know that we're likely to get a big disaster. They just need to let us know as soon as it's practicable. So, if you got the food, go ahead and start using it, but we're telling the schools to give us a call afterwards. We can bring in foods from other schools. We can bring in school food from the warehouse or even from other states. The foods do need to be used to make prepared meals. So in this option, we're not talking about grocery distribution. It is okay if those meals are taken off-site for delivery or grab and go. And then if it ends up being a situation of distress, those meals for 30 days can be reimbursed or replaced, those foods. Or if it's a presidentially declared disaster, it's a longer period of time. And then there are also USDA foods known as TFAP foods that are located at your local food pantry that could also be used that way. Generally, for preparing meals, we're going to want to use those food service sizes at schools, but just for your awareness, those TFAP foods at food pantries can be used there too. And then if the school isn't activated or isn't producing the meals, we can take those foods and deliver them to other emergency feeding organizations. But again, that requires state agency approval. Don't do that without a phone call to us here at the Agency of Education, or you can contact the SCOC and they can get that approval from us. This is some information on what you would need to track if you were going to use those USDA foods. And I am going to just leave this slide. You can come back to it later and read it. I will say that you can use those foods to make meals for first responders and volunteers, but they can't be the primary folks who are getting the meals. So more than half of the people that you are serving do need to be those impacted by the disaster. These foods are not really meant to be used to produce volunteer meals. And then these USDA foods that are on hand at your school or at your local food pantry, we can do something called disaster household distribution of those foods, where we're not making meals, we're giving those foods out directly. This is going to be more appropriate for the household size foods that are at the local food pantries. We have to get USDA authorization for that, and it usually takes a few days to get that. And that's usually going to be something that we do in conjunction with the Vermont Food Bank. But if grocery distribution or food pantries have been disrupted in your community, do reach out to us about that, because that is something that we can get approval from USDA. And again, we'll take the foods that we have on hand and use those. We may bring in foods from nearby, and then USDA will come in later and replace or reimburse the value of those foods. I mentioned that there is this program, the CACFP, that could be used to provide 3 meals per day, 7 days per week to children in emergency shelters. Unfortunately, this program is very, very paperwork intensive. So it's not going to be a good option if the school is not operating it already. But if you're in your conversation with your school, if you find out that they are operating this program, then it could be a good option if your school is a shelter, or if you're operating a shelter in your community, to have the school operate this program. And again, that's going to provide USDA funding for 3 meals per day for children 18 and under, 7 days a week at an emergency shelter. We have a slide here on homeless students and identifying homeless students. So in schools, there's something called the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act that ensures that students who are defined as homeless, and you see the definition under that act here, which is a pretty broad definition, including kids who are sharing the housing of others, living in motels or hotels, or living in emergency or transitional shelters. So this is a lot of the families that you might be working with displaced in a disaster. They're going to meet this definition. If they're identified by their local school homeless liaison, they are suddenly eligible for a lot of additional support through that school. And that's going to include funding for transportation to that school so that they can continue going to that school, food. So meals may be available through that. Eyeglasses, school supplies, clothes, laundry, anything that child needs to continue to access their education. So if you've got families in a shelter or in a hotel because of a disaster, make sure that you connect them with the local school homeless liaison so that they're able to access all of these resources. And there's a link here that will bring you to the list if you get these slides afterwards on the Agency of Education website of who the local school homeless liaisons are.
And I will say, unfortunately, we are
We are
already
at
over
time.
So these
So-
slides will be posted up on our website next week. And I believe your contact information is at the end of these slides. Is that correct, Rosie?
It is at the end of these slides. So here's that list of questions to talk to your local school food service director about. And if you want to find out who your local school food service director is, here is my contact information, and you can certainly reach out to me and I can help you make that connection.